The gun was already drawn when Ida Collins walked through the door of the Stone Ranch, and every soul in Hollow Creek knew that Edgar Stone had never once pointed that weapon at a woman. Until tonight. He stood at the far end of the long kitchen table, 6 feet 2 inches of coiled fury and something rower underneath it, something that looked almost like desperation. The oil lamp threw gold and shadow across the sharp planes of his face, and his gray eyes that half the women in Cochise County, Arizona had described in private letters and whispered confessions, were locked on her with an expression she had never seen on a man before. Not rage exactly. Not grief exactly. Something that lived between the two, something that had been building for years before she ever set foot in this territory, something that had been waiting for a woman to survive long enough to see it. "You went through my papers," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that was more dangerous than shouting. "You found the deed." Ida did not flinch. That was the thing about her, the thing nobody in Hollow Creek had understood from the moment she arrived 3 weeks ago on the afternoon stage from Tucson, dusty and unimpressed and carrying nothing but a single leather satchel. She did not flinch. "I did," she said. "That deed belongs to the Navarro family. I have been hiding it for 2 years." His hand on the revolver was perfectly steady. "Anyone who knows about it is a liability, Miss Collins." "Then shoot me," she said simply, and folded her hands in front of her apron as if they were discussing the weather, as if a loaded Colt was not aimed at her chest, as if the secret she now carried was not the most dangerous thing in the whole of Cochise County. The silence that followed was the longest 15 seconds of both their lives. And then something in Edgar Stone's face broke open. The gun lowered. He set it on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel, and he pressed both hands flat against the wood, and he stared at her with those gray eyes wide. And Ida Collins understood that she had done the thing that no other woman in Hollow Creek had ever managed to do, not by pursuing him, not by flirting, not by leaving pies on his porch or sending their brothers to speak well of them. She had done it by standing perfectly still, by refusing to run, by looking at a man with a gun aimed at her heart and saying, "Go ahead." She had reached Edgar Stone by refusing to try. But to understand why that mattered, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back 3 weeks, to the afternoon stage, to the red dust of the Arizona Territory in the autumn of 1883, and to a woman who had come west for reasons that had nothing at all to do with love. The stage from Tucson arrived in Hollow Creek every Tuesday and Friday, and on that particular Tuesday in October it carried 4 passengers. A traveling dry goods merchant named Horace Webb, who sweated through his collar and talked without stopping for the entire 4-hour journey. A cattle broker from Tombstone named Delray Hicks, who slept through most of it and smelled faintly of whiskey. A young couple, recently married, who held hands and looked out the window at the desert with the luminous, terrified expressions of people who had not yet realized what they had gotten themselves into. And Ida Collins. She was 26 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, medium in height, neither beautiful nor plain in the conventional sense of those words, but possessed of a quality that was harder to name and easier to feel, a settled quality, a stillness, as though she had made her peace with the world at some point in the recent past and had decided to proceed without complaint. She wore a plain gray traveling dress and sensible boots, and she watched the desert pass with neither fear nor wonder, just attention, just steady, quiet attention. She had come to Hollow Creek because her uncle, Franklin Collins, had left her his dry goods store when he died of pneumonia the previous spring. She had not known him well. She had not known he owned property in Arizona. She had found out from the lawyer's letter, and she had looked at her situation in Kansas City, the rooming house, the seamstress work, the slow grinding weight of a life that was respectable but barely, and she had decided that she would rather have a dry goods store in the desert than a respectable grinding weight anywhere else. It was purely practical. She was not running from anything. She was not looking for anything. She was simply moving toward better odds, the way a sensible woman does when she has no one else to think about and nothing to lose. The stage rolled into Hollow Creek at 3:30 in the afternoon, and Ida stepped down into the red dust and looked around at her new town. It was a proper town for the Arizona Territory in 1883. Main Street ran straight and wide, with boardwalks on both sides and buildings that ranged from solid adobe to rough timber. There was a general store, a hardware store, a hotel called the Copper Star, a barber shop, a post office, 2 saloons, a church, a livery stable, and a telegraph office. There were women in bonnets and men in wide-brimmed hats and a few vaqueros lounging outside the second saloon with the easy posture of men who belonged to the land more than the town did. There were children running along the boardwalk and a dog sleeping in the middle of the street who declined to move for anything. It looked like a place where a person could make something reasonable of themselves. The dry goods store was called Collins Mercantile, and it was on the west end of Main Street, locked and dusty from 6 months of nobody running it. The neighboring business, a leather goods and saddle shop, was owned by a stout, cheerful woman named Ruth Abernethy, who had apparently been watching the store with devotion since Franklin Collins passed. Ruth was the first person to speak to Ida, and Ruth was, as Ida would come to understand, the primary news service for the entire population of Hollow Creek. "You must be the niece," Ruth said, appearing at her elbow approximately 30 seconds after Ida stepped off the stage. "Franklin talked about you sometimes, said you were the sensible one in the family. I'm Ruth Abernethy. I have the key to your store. Come on and I'll walk you through it." Ida introduced herself and they walked together down the boardwalk. And within those 3 short blocks, Ruth Abernethy told her the following things. The population of Hollow Creek was approximately 400 souls. It had been founded primarily by silver mining interests, though the ranching had outlasted the mines. The current sheriff was a competent man named Voss who had been keeping order for 7 years. The water situation was manageable since the well near the church had held steady even through dry summers, and the most talked-about person in the entire county was a rancher named Edgar Stone. "Stone," Ida said. "Edgar Stone. Owns the biggest spread in the valley, the Stone Ranch, about 4 miles east of town. He's been here 12 years. Came from Virginia originally before the war." Ruth unlocked the front door of Collins Mercantile and pushed it open. Every unmarried woman in this town has tried to get his attention at some point, and a few of the married ones if we're being truthful. "Why?" Ida asked, not because she was particularly interested, but because Ruth had clearly been building to this, and it was efficient to let her finish. "Because he is the most closed-off, difficult, handsome, and apparently decent man for 50 miles in any direction," Ruth said cheerfully. "He doesn't drink to excess, doesn't gamble more than he can afford, keeps his word, pays his debts, and treats his ranch hands fairly. Also, he has the sort of face that poets write about, though I wouldn't say that to his face because it would only make him more disagreeable. He does not want company. He does not want conversation. He does not want anyone to try to fix him or reach him or get past his walls, as the younger girls put it when they've been reading too many novels." "Has he ever been married?" Ida asked, looking around the store. The shelves were dusty but intact. The inventory was old but present. The accounts ledger was in the drawer under the counter exactly where her uncle's lawyer had told her it would be. "Engaged," Ruth said. "Once, before he came west. I don't know the details because he's never told anyone, but there was a woman back east and something happened and he came out here alone and he's been alone ever since." She paused. "That was 12 years ago, mind you. He's 34 now." "That's a long time to be alone," Ida said, mostly to herself, opening the ledger. "It is," Ruth agreed. "But being alone and wanting company are 2 different things, and Edgar Stone seems to have made up his mind about which one he prefers." Ida nodded and turned to the matter of her inventory, and she put Edgar Stone in the same mental filing place where she put most of the things she heard about in the first week in a new place noted, not urgent, probably not her concern. She was wrong about the last part. She spent her first week putting the store in order. She was methodical and efficient, and she had a gift for organization that her uncle, apparently, had not shared. Because the back room was a chaos of mismatched crates and poorly labeled stock that took 3 full days to sort. She hired a boy of 15 named Tommy Pratt to help with the heavy lifting and sweeping, and she opened for business on Monday of her second week, and by Wednesday she had a reliable stream of customers. She was good with customers. She had been doing some form of retail work since she was 16, first in her parents' small shop in Missouri before the drought years took it, then in Kansas City in various capacities. She knew how to listen to what people actually needed rather than what they said they needed, and she knew how to price fairly, and she knew how to extend credit carefully, and she knew how to make a person feel seen and valued without becoming their friend in a way that complicated business. People liked her. They said she was straightforward and honest. They said she had her uncle's eye for inventory but more sense. Ruth Abernethy, who had become something between a neighbor and a friendly informant, told her on Friday of her first week of operation that she was already considered a good addition to the town. Better than the last woman who tried to run a business on this street, Ruth said. She spent more time trying to get Edgar Stone to look at her than she spent on accounts, and she was foreclosed inside of 8 months. That seems like poor planning, Ida said. It was, Ruth agreed. But you understand, Edgar Stone has that effect on women here. He's like a puzzle that everyone wants to solve and nobody can. Ida glanced up from the bolt of fabric she was measuring. What does he actually look like? Tall, dark hair going a little gray at the sides. Gray eyes very clear, the kind that seem to look right through you. Strong jaw. Serious expression that very occasionally does something that might be a smile, though some people debate whether it's actually a smile or just a less severe version of his regular expression. Ruth tilted her head. Why, are you curious? You've mentioned him 4 times this week, Ida said. I'm just trying to put a face to the name. Ruth looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement or assessment or both. He'll be in town Saturday morning, she said. He comes every 2 weeks for supplies. You'll see him. Saturday morning arrived, and Ida was behind her counter at 7:30 when the door opened, and she got her first look at the man who had reportedly broken the collective romantic spirit of every unattached woman in Hollow Creek. He was tall, as Ruth had said. The dark hair was thick and neat under his hat, silver at the temples in a way that suggested a man who had thought hard about difficult things for many years. The jaw was strong. The eyes were exactly the gray that Ruth had described, clear and direct and deeply, noticeably guarded. He wore working clothes that were clean and well-maintained. He moved through the door with the kind of physical presence that came not from swagger but from the complete absence of self-consciousness, and he went directly to the counter with the focused manner of a man who had a list and intended to work through it. He set the list on the counter without looking up. Ida looked at the list. Flour 20 pounds, she said, reading it. Coffee 5 pounds, salt 10 pounds, axle grease 1 tin, leather oil, pine tar soap, wire nails 1/4 pound box, matches. She looked up. I have all of this. Give me about 20 minutes and I'll have it packed. He looked up then, apparently because the transaction had proceeded without any of the usual preamble, and his gray eyes settled on her face with that clear, direct look. You're the new owner, he said. Ida Collins, she said. Franklin was my uncle. Franklin was a decent man, Edgar Stone said. He gave fair weight and didn't overcharge for credit. I intend the same, she said, and went to pull his order. She was efficient. She did not make conversation. She did not ask him how the ranch was going or whether he needed company or whether he had heard about the church social next Saturday. She filled his order, packed it correctly, wrote the total in her ledger and told him the price. He paid, loaded his goods into his wagon and left. Ruth appeared at the door 3 minutes later, practically vibrating. You spoke to him, she said. He placed an order and I filled it, Ida said. He spoke. He said more than 3 words. Ida, he has been coming into this store for 12 years and he has never said more than 3 words to Franklin, and Franklin was a man. Ruth leaned on the counter. What did you say to him? I read his list back to him and told him how long it would take, Ida said. Ruth stared at her. That's it. That's it. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. You didn't bat your eyes at him. I was filling an order, not performing, Ida said mildly. You didn't ask him anything personal. Why would I? He came for supplies. Ruth leaned further on the counter, looking at Ida with an expression that was moving from amusement to something more thoughtful and wondering. Do you know, she said slowly, that Miriam Porter spent 2 months trying to engineer accidental meetings with that man before he stopped coming into town on Saturdays and switched to every other week? Do you know that the Dawson girl left a cake on his porch, and he left it there, until it rotted without ever acknowledging it? Do you know that the schoolteacher, Miss Farrow, asked him directly if he would like to come to Sunday dinner, and he said, and I quote, "No thank you, ma'am," and then walked away? That sounds like a man who doesn't want to be pursued, Ida said. That is exactly what he is, Ruth said. So what are you going to do about it? Nothing, Ida said. He's a customer. I'll fill his orders and give him fair weight. That's all there is to it. Ruth looked at her for a long time. Ida Collins, she said finally, you are either the most sensible woman in this territory or you are going to accidentally drive that man absolutely mad. It turned out to be both. 2 weeks passed. Edgar Stone came back on a Saturday, same time, same manner. He set his list on the counter. Ida filled it. He paid. He left. The interaction took less than 10 minutes, was perfectly courteous on both sides, and included no personal inquiries, no lingering looks, and no attempts by either party to be anything other than what they were in that moment, which was a shopkeeper and a customer. He came back 2 weeks after that. And this time, something was slightly different. He set his list on the counter as usual, and Ida read through it, and then she paused at the last item. Carbolic acid, she said. How much? A quart if you have it. I have it. She looked at his list again. You're also asking for linseed oil and sulfur. Are you treating something or preventing something? He looked at her with that clear gray gaze. Foot rot, he said. In the cattle. I've been managing it, but I had a wet week and it spread. My uncle kept a home treatment formula in the back, she said. It's in his notes. Carbolic acid with zinc sulfate and copper sulfate in specific proportions packed into the hooves. It works better than carbolic alone. Would you like me to write it out? There was a brief pause. Yes, he said. I would. She wrote it out on a piece of paper from her ledger, clearly and in full, with the proportions and the method. She added a note at the bottom about isolating affected cattle from healthy ones until treatment was complete. He read it over carefully. Where did you learn this? He asked. My father ran cattle for a time before dry goods, she said. He lost most of a herd to foot rot once. After that he was very thorough about prevention. Kansas, Missouri first, Kansas City later. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Thank you, Miss Collins. You're welcome, Mr. Stone. He paid, loaded his goods, and left, but he was back the following Saturday, not on the regular 2-week schedule. I tried the formula, he said when he came in. It's working. Good, she said. I had a question about the zinc sulfate concentration, he said. Whether it should be adjusted for severity. It can be, she said, and they talked about it for 7 minutes, which was, according to Ruth Abernethy, who tracked these things with the dedication of a professional historian, the longest conversation Edgar Stone had voluntarily engaged in with anyone in Hollow Creek in 4 years. Ida did not notice that it was exceptional. She was talking about zinc sulfate, but Edgar Stone noticed. He noticed because he was a careful man, a man who had built walls so high and so thick after the events of 1871 in Richmond, Virginia, that he had genuinely come to believe no one would ever find a way past them, not because he was cruel, but because he had been very thoroughly hurt and had taken thorough precautions against it happening again. He noticed that this woman talked to him the way a person talks to another person who happens to be present and knowledgeable, without agenda, without the particular quality of performed interest that he had learned to recognize and recoil from in the 12 years he had spent in Hollow Creek. He noticed that she did not look at him the way other women looked at him. He did not know what to do with that. He went home and thought about it and found that the thinking did not resolve into anything clear, so he went back to his work, which was always the thing he could trust. The Stone Ranch was a proper working cattle operation, one of the largest in Cochise County. Edgar had built it from a single-room adobe structure and 40 head of cattle to a genuine going concern with 230 head, 4 permanent hands, a solid stone main house, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and corrals that were the envy of every rancher within 40 miles. He had done it through 12 years of relentless work and extremely careful management and an almost fanatical attention to detail. He was, by every external measure, a successful man. He was also a profoundly solitary one. His hands respected him and somewhat feared him and would not have traded working for him for any other employer in the territory, because he was fair, he paid on time, and he worked harder than any of them. His foreman, a veteran cowhand named Burl Egan, had been with him for 9 years and could read Edgar's silences the way other men read words. "You're thinking about something," Burl said one evening in November when they were sitting on the porch of the main house after a day of fall roundup. "I'm thinking about the cattle formula," Edgar said. "You've been thinking about that formula for 2 weeks," Burl said. "The cattle are fine now. What are you actually thinking about?" Edgar was quiet for a long time. "The woman who runs Collins Mercantile," he said finally. Burl said nothing, which was his way of saying more. "She's not like the others," Edgar said. He stopped himself. "That came out wrong." "No, it didn't," Burl said. "She's just straightforward. She fills orders. She gives good information when she has it." "She doesn't," he stopped again. "She doesn't try," Burl said. Edgar looked at him. "I've seen her," Burl said. "When I go in to get the hand supplies sometimes, she's just there doing her work. She doesn't perform anything. She just is what she is." He scratched his jaw. "It's different." "It is different," Edgar agreed. "What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Edgar said. "She's not. She didn't come here for that. She came here to run the store." "That doesn't mean she can't be interested in other things," Burl said. "I'm not in a position to offer anything to anyone," Edgar said, and there was something in his voice that closed the conversation, the same way a door closes, not with violence but with finality. Burl was quiet for a while. "You know," he said eventually, "you've been saying that for 12 years. Edgar didn't answer, but the door was no longer quite as firmly closed as it had been, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, back in town, a conversation of a different kind was happening. Miriam Porter, who was 24 and the daughter of the town's most prosperous merchant, had made it her project for the better part of 2 years to attract Edgar Stone's serious attention. She was pretty and well-mannered and not unintelligent, and she had tried very nearly everything: the social calls, the baked goods left at his property line, the coincidental appearances on the road between town and the ranch, the carefully engineered introductions at church. None of it had produced anything more than a polite and increasingly cool acknowledgement of her existence. When she heard about Ida Collins talking to Edgar Stone about cattle medicine, she was not pleased. "It's just business," said her friend Clara Dawson. "She runs the store." "He stayed for 7 minutes, Miriam said. "He has never stayed for 7 minutes anywhere except his own property." "Maybe he had foot rot concerns," Clara said. "Clara." "Miriam, she's just a shopkeeper. She's not trying to attract him. Everyone can see that." "Maybe that's exactly the problem," Miriam said, and her voice had an edge in it that her friend did not entirely understand. She called on Ida the following week under the guise of purchasing ribbon and thread. She was friendly and pleasant, the way she had learned to be with potential rivals, which was warmly but with a slight suggestion of your place being clear. Ida was warmly pleasant back and sold her ribbon and thread at a fair price, and offered no indication whatsoever that she was aware of being in any kind of competition. Because she wasn't. That was the thing that Miriam could not quite process. Ida Collins was genuinely not trying to attract Edgar Stone. She was not playing a sophisticated game of hard to get. She was not performing indifference as a strategy. She was indifferent, not in a cold or dismissive way, but in the way a person is indifferent to weather. She noted it. She dealt with it practically when it was relevant, and she did not spend emotional energy on it. "Don't you find him attractive?" Miriam asked, with the bright casual directness of a woman who has decided that a direct approach will produce useful information. Ida looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Stone." "Yes." Ida considered the question with the same honest, unadorned consideration she gave to everything. "He's a handsome man," she said. "He seems competent and direct. I don't know him well enough to have a stronger opinion." "Most women in this town have a very strong opinion," Miriam said. "I've noticed that," Ida said. "It seems like a lot of energy to spend on someone who appears not to want the attention." Miriam looked at her for a long moment, and then she left with her ribbon, and she was thoughtful all the way home. November deepened. The nights in the Arizona Territory turned cold and clear, the kind of cold that was all dry air and brilliant stars, nothing like the damp gray winters of the East. Ida had settled into her store and her rhythms, and she found that she liked Hollow Creek more than she had expected to. She liked the directness of the people here, the way the landscape clarified things. She had made genuine acquaintances, if not yet deep friends, and the store was doing well, better than her uncle's records suggested it had done in years, because she had a talent for what to stock and how to price it, and how to make the place feel welcoming without being precious about it. She had also, entirely without intending to, learned a great deal about Edgar Stone, not from chasing the information, but because it came to her in the ordinary course of running a business in a small town. People talked. People mentioned him. His hands came in for supplies and talked about the ranch. Ruth next door talked about him as naturally as she talked about the weather. The patterns of the town included him whether she attended to them or not. She knew that he had a younger brother in Virginia, whom he hadn't seen in 10 years. She knew that he had rebuilt his stone main house after a fire 6 years ago, and that the fire had apparently been deliberately set by a cattle competitor named Harlan, who had left the territory under murky circumstances shortly afterward. She knew that he gave work to men others wouldn't hire, veterans with injuries, older cowboys past their prime riding years, men who had made mistakes and needed a second chance. She knew that he had once ridden 30 miles in a snowstorm to get the doctor for a Mexican family that worked on a neighboring spread, because the neighboring spread's owner wouldn't do it. She knew that he was lonely in the way that careful, wounded people are lonely, not acutely, not in a way he admitted to himself, but chronically, in the way a house with all its shutters permanently closed is somehow still a house that misses the light. She did not know what to do with any of this information, so she did nothing with it. She filed it away the way she filed things, acknowledged, not urgent, probably not her concern. And then, on a Wednesday evening in late November, everything shifted. She had stayed late at the store doing accounts. It was past 7 in the evening when she locked up and stepped out onto the boardwalk, and the street was quiet in the way that small western towns get quiet after dark. Not empty. The saloons were going. There was lamplight in the hotel. Someone was playing a harmonica somewhere down the block. But still, the way a room gets still when the day's work is done. She was walking toward her room at the Copper Star Hotel, where she had been living while she decided whether to rent the small house Franklin had owned on the edge of town, when she heard voices raised in a way that had a particular quality, the quality of an argument that had passed from words into something more dangerous. She paused and looked. Across the street, in the gap between the hardware store and the land office, 2 men were facing each other in the lamplight from the hardware store window. One of them she didn't know, a rangy man in a duster coat with something aggressive in his posture. The other was Edgar Stone. Edgar Stone was perfectly still. "You've been sitting on that deed for 2 years, the rangy man said. His voice carried in the quiet air. "Covington knows you have it. He's done waiting." Tell Covington to come see me himself if he wants to talk about deeds, Edgar said. His voice was that same measured low evenness, but there was steel in it now, the kind of steel that is very old and very tested. Covington doesn't come to conversations, the rangy man said. He sends outcomes. I know what Covington sends, Edgar said. I also know that if he wanted an outcome tonight, you would not be standing here talking about it. There was a pause. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, the rangy man said. I've got something that doesn't belong to Covington, Edgar said. Which is a different thing. The rangy man stood there another moment, and then he looked up and noticed Ida standing on the far boardwalk watching, and something shifted in his expression and he stepped back. Your clock is running, Stone, he said, and he walked away. Edgar watched him go. Then he turned and looked across the street at Ida. They stood there for a moment looking at each other across the dark street. Are you all right? She called. Yes, he said. Was that a threat? Yes. She considered that for a moment. From someone named Covington. His expression changed slightly, not a full emotion, but the sign of one, the way a shadow on a hillside tells you something about the sun. How much of that did you hear? Most of it, she said honestly. He stood there looking at her. Then after a moment that seemed to cost him something, he said, Are you going straight back to the hotel? I was. Would you wait a minute, he said. Not a question quite, but not fully a command either. Something in between. A request from a man who didn't ask for much. Yes, she said. He crossed the street, and they stood together on the boardwalk in the cold November evening. And Edgar Stone told her, in the measured and economical way that was his nature, more than he had told anyone in Hollow Creek in a long time. Emmett Covington was the largest landowner in the county now, having acquired or pushed out most of the smaller ranchers over the past 5 years. He was based out of Tombstone, but operated through agents and enforcers. He had been systematically acquiring land in the valley using a combination of legal pressure and methods that were less legal, including running cattle off water sources, damaging fences, and in at least 2 instances that Edgar knew of, document forgery. The Navarro family, Alejandro Navarro, his wife, and their 3 grown sons had worked a small ranch east of Hollow Creek for 20 years. They were Mexican-born, naturalized citizens, good people by every account. Covington had decided he wanted their land because it sat across the best water access in the valley, a creek called Agua Dulce that ran year-round. 8 months ago, there had been a fire at the Navarro place. Nobody had been hurt, but the main house had burned, and in the fire the Navarro family had lost most of their records, including their land deed. Covington had moved quickly. He had produced a competing claim, a document Edgar believed was forged, and he had filed it with the county land office in Tombstone while the Navarros were still sorting through the ash. But Alejandro Navarro, before the fire, had done something careful and quiet. He had made a copy of his land deed and given it to Edgar Stone for safekeeping because he had trusted Edgar and because he had feared that something might happen. Something had happened. Edgar had that copy. It was the proof that invalidated Covington's claim. And Covington knew he had it, which was why that conversation had just happened in the alley. Why haven't you taken it to the authorities? Ida asked. The county sheriff in Tombstone has a comfortable relationship with Covington, Edgar said. I've been trying to reach the U.S. Marshal's office out of Tucson without tipping Covington off about what I'm doing. It takes time. The Marshals have a lot of territory and not a lot of men. So you're waiting. I'm protecting the document and waiting for the right moment to move. She was quiet for a moment, looking down the dark street. That man tonight, she said. He works for Covington. His name is Garth Sable. He's Covington's head enforcer. He's not the type to bluff. No, she agreed. He didn't sound like he was bluffing. Another silence. The harmonica somewhere down the block played something old and mournful. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that the question had surprised him, that he was asking it himself. Because you heard it, he said finally. And I'd rather you had the full picture than a partial one. A partial picture is more dangerous. "That's a practical reason," she said. "I'm a practical man. And if I told someone, if I told Covington's people what I know—" "You won't," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you told me you heard the conversation instead of walking past without saying anything," he said. "That's what a person does when they want you to know they're not a threat." She considered that for a moment, and then she almost smiled, which was something that did not happen on her face very often, but which, when it happened, was the kind of thing that changed a room. "That is a very precise observation," she said. "I pay attention," he said. "So do I," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, and then he said good evening and crossed back across the street and collected his horse from the livery and rode out of town. And Ida walked back to the hotel, and she lay awake for a while thinking about a man who had built 12 years of silence around himself, and tonight, for reasons that had something to do with practicality and something to do with things harder to name, had broken a little of it open. She thought about that. She put it in the file marked acknowledged, not urgent, possibly her concern after all. December came in cold and bright. Ida was busy, the way a dry goods store in a working ranching community gets busy before winter really sets in, people stocking up on things, buying heavier goods, the rhythms of practical frontier life playing out in the inventory of her shelves. She liked being busy. She liked the clarity of useful work. Edgar Stone came in on his regular bi-weekly schedule, same list on the counter, same efficient transaction. But the quality of it was different now, not dramatically. There was no sudden warmth, no personal inquiry, nothing that could be described as courtship or even friendship. But there was a different texture to the silence between words, the way silence has different qualities depending on what fills it. And what filled this silence was the knowledge that they had both looked at something real about each other and had not looked away. He mentioned one morning in passing that the marshal's office had sent a wire saying they would have an agent in Tombstone in the new year who could receive his evidence. "That's good news," she said. "It should resolve the Navarro situation," he said. "How are the Navarros managing in the meantime?" He looked at her as though the question surprised him again, and then something in his face shifted toward the thing that Burl and others had debated was a smile. "They're staying with family in Tucson. I've been keeping an eye on their property." "Of course you have," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That came out sounding like a compliment," he said. "It was meant to," she said. He paid and left, and Ruth Abernethy, who had been pretending to look at button cards on the far side of the store for the past 10 minutes, materialized at the counter as soon as the door closed. "Ida," she said. "Don't," Ida said. He almost smiled. "He has a life. So do I. Fill the button card back up when you're done, please." Ruth filled the button card back up with an expression of patient, entertained exasperation and said nothing more. But the town was talking. Hollow Creek was the kind of place where everything was noticed, and most of it was discussed. And the slow and entirely mutual and entirely unacknowledged thing developing between the keeper of Collins Mercantile and the most famously unreachable man in the county was the subject of more conversation than anything since the fire at the Navarro place. Miriam Porter, who had moved through her initial sharpness into something more reflective, had a conversation with her mother about it that was more honest than most conversations she had with her mother. "She's not doing anything," she said. "That's the infuriating part. She just does her work and talks to him about cattle medicine and land deeds and nothing, and he comes back." "That's what happens," her mother said, who was 53 and had seen a great deal. "When you stop trying to be what someone needs and just are what you are, sometimes the right person notices." "But she's not even trying to be noticed," Miriam said. "That's what I mean," her mother said. Miriam sat with that for a while, and then she decided she was going to be a generous person about it, because she had never actually known Edgar Stone and had been in love with an idea of him rather than the man, and because watching Ida Collins be quietly, consistently, unself-consciously herself was, she found, unexpectedly instructive. She went to Ida's store a few days later and bought some fabric, and before she left she said, plainly and without any particular drama. "I want you to know I think you're good for this town. And I think if anything comes of whatever is not happening between you and Mr. Stone, I think that would be a good thing too." Ida looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "Thank you, Miriam," she said. "That was generous of you to say." "I've decided to be a more generous person," Miriam said. "That sounds like a very good decision," Ida said. There was a pause. "Do you actually feel anything for him?" Miriam asked. "Or is it really just business?" Ida was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet where a person is actually checking rather than performing deliberation. "I don't know," she said. "I notice him. I think about the things he says after he leaves. I find him more interesting than most people I've met." She paused again. "But I'm not going to do anything about it because I don't think that's what either of us needs right now." "What does either of you need right now?" Miriam asked. "I think he needs someone who doesn't need him to be anything other than what he is," Ida said. "And I think I need to find out whether I can build something real here before I start worrying about building something with anyone." Miriam left with her fabric, and she thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, and it changed several things about the way she thought about love and what it needed to grow. January brought the cold fully in, and with it, things began to move faster. The first thing that happened was the wire from the U.S. Marshal's office. Edgar received it on a Thursday morning, and he rode into town that afternoon rather than waiting for his regular Saturday visit. He came to the store after hours, after Ida had closed for the day, but before she had gone upstairs to tidy her accounts, and he knocked at the back door, which she opened still in her work apron with her ledger in her hand. He looked at her for a moment as though the sight of her in that entirely ordinary state caught him off guard. "The Marshal's agent is in Tombstone," he said. "I'm riding there Saturday to hand over the deed. I want to do it before Covington's people figure out what I'm planning." "That's a good plan," she said. "What do you need?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had that quality she had started to learn, the quality of a man reaching across something internal that required effort. "I'm not sure," he said. "I've been managing this alone for 8 months and he stopped." "You wanted to tell someone," she said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "Yes," he said. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee if you want to talk it through." He came in. They sat at the small table in the back room among her inventory and her account books, and the coffee was strong and black. And they talked for an hour and a half, not about feelings, not about the thing that was building between them like something slow and underground and real, but about the practical matter of the deed, and the best way to get it to the Marshal, and what would happen afterward. Edgar had thought it through carefully and had a solid plan, but talking it through helped the way having a second clear mind helps. And Ida asked the questions that found the gaps in the plan, and they filled those gaps together. By the end of it, the plan was better, and they both knew it, and there was something between them in the lamplight of the back room that was different from everything that had come before, not just the particular warmth of intellectual respect and mutual trust, but something else, something that was going to require one of them to say something eventually. Edgar stood to go. He stood at the door for a moment, hat in hand. "Ida," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. She looked up. He started to say something and then stopped himself, and she could see very clearly the war inside him, the 12 years of walls and the thing that was trying to find a way past them. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee and the thinking." "Anytime," she said, and she meant it, and he knew she meant it, and he went out into the cold January night and rode back toward his ranch. And Ida sat at her little table with the lamp burning low and found that her hands had gone very still and her mind was very quiet, and there was a feeling in her chest that was new and warm and somewhat terrifying and not entirely unwelcome. She thought, "Oh," she thought, "that's what that is." She thought, "I have not been as indifferent as I supposed." She did not know what to do with it, so she finished her accounts and went to bed. Saturday came. Edgar rode to Tombstone with the deed wrapped in oilcloth in the inside pocket of his coat. carrying with him 12 years of solitary, honorable stubbornness and 2 years of particular danger, and he handed it to the U.S. Marshal's agent, a methodical man from Illinois named Callahan, who examined it carefully and asked several questions, and then said, in the flat measured way of a federal officer, that this was sufficient to initiate proceedings against Emmett Covington's fraudulent land claim, and that the Navarro family would be notified of their right to return to their property. Edgar rode home with the knowledge that he had done what he promised Alejandro Navarro he would do, and that the danger was not entirely past. Covington would be informed and would be angry, but that the legal protection was now in place. He did not feel the complete relief he had expected to feel. He felt something else instead, which was the strange empty space that appears when a purpose you have been organized around is finally discharged, and the question arises of what comes next. He rode home in the cold January afternoon and went into his stone house and built a fire and sat with it for a while. Burl knocked and came in an hour later. "How did it go?" he said. "The way it should have," Edgar said. "The Navarros will get their land back." "Yes." Burl was quiet for a moment. "So that's done." "That's done. And now what?" Burl asked. Edgar looked at the fire. "I don't know yet," he said. "You could start by talking to the woman at the store," Burl said in the casual tone of a man who has been building to this for several months. "She didn't come here for that," Edgar said. It was what he had said before, but it had lost some of its certainty. "Have you asked her what she came here for?" Burl said. Edgar was quiet. "Because in my experience," Burl continued, settling into the other chair near the fire with the ease of a man who had long since earned the right to speak plainly to his employer, what a person comes to a place for and what a place turns out to give them are not always the same thing. "You're not subtle," Edgar said. "I've been working for you for 9 years," Burl said. "Being subtle hasn't gotten you anywhere." Edgar looked at the fire for a long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to another person in a very long time. "Yes, you do," Burl said. "You know how to be honest, and you know how to be straight, and you know how to respect a person. That's how you do it." Edgar sat with that the way he sat with hard things, thoroughly and without self-pity. "What happened in Richmond?" he said, and stopped. "You don't have to tell me," Burl said. "I've heard the outline. It doesn't have to define you forever." "It was," Edgar started again carefully. "I was 22 and I asked a woman to marry me and she said yes, and then I came back from the war and she had married someone else. While I was gone, without telling me." He paused. "That's the outline." "I know," Burl said. "I understood why she did it. The war was long and everyone was uncertain and she had her reasons. But I had built my entire understanding of the future around that one thing, around her, around us, and when that was gone," he stopped. "You decided not to build around a person again," Burl said. "I decided not to build around hope," Edgar corrected. "Around something uncertain. I only build on solid ground." "Solid ground," Burl said. "Like a woman who walks into a gun barrel without flinching and says what she means and has never once tried to get something from you that you weren't offering freely." Edgar looked at him. "I'm just saying," Burl said. "That seems like solid ground to me." Later that week, on a Wednesday, it was Ida who triggered what would turn out to be the most important and most dangerous evening since she arrived in Hollow Creek. She was alone in the store late afternoon, doing inventory of a new shipment that had come in on the stage. She was in the back room, methodically checking items against the invoice, when she went to move a crate from the lower shelf and found something behind it. It was a folded paper wrapped in oilcloth, pushed to the very back of the lowest shelf behind a crate of axle grease that had been there since Franklin's time. She unfolded it carefully, and she read it, and she sat very still for a long time. It was a copy of a letter in her Uncle Franklin's handwriting, addressed to someone named D. Harlan. It was dated 3 years ago. It was about water rights and land access, and it referenced a deed, and it referenced an arrangement. And the more she read it, the more clearly she understood that her Uncle Franklin Collins, decent Franklin Collins who gave fair weight and didn't overcharge for credit, had at some point been involved in an arrangement with Covington's interests regarding the suppression of the Navarro land claim. The letter did not say anything explicitly illegal, but it said enough that a person who knew the situation could understand its implications. She sat with it for a long time. She understood why it mattered. This letter in the wrong hands could complicate the legal proceedings Edgar had just initiated in Tombstone. It could be used by Covington's lawyers to suggest that the deed Edgar had submitted was connected to a larger fraudulent scheme, to muddy the waters, to delay and confuse. It could also simply be evidence of something her uncle had done that was not admirable, which was a different kind of difficult. She did not panic. She thought, the Marshal's agent Callahan should know about this letter so that it cannot be used as a surprise. She thought, Edgar should know about this letter because it is connected to something he has been protecting for 2 years. She thought, how do I know this won't make things worse? And she thought, I don't, but hiding it would definitely make things worse. That evening, she went to the Stone Ranch for the first time. She had borrowed a horse from the livery, a steady chestnut mare, and she rode the 4 miles out on the road east of town in the cold winter evening with the letter in her satchel, and the particular quality of composure she carried everywhere. And she arrived at the ranch as the sun was going behind the hills, and the lamps were coming on in the stone house. One of the hands met her in the yard and she asked for Edgar, and the hand went inside, and a moment later Edgar appeared on the porch. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly: surprise, concern, the particular alertness of a man who has learned that unexpected arrivals usually mean something significant. Ida, he said, is everything all right? I found something, she said, and dismounted. In the store, in the back room, I think you need to see it. He brought her inside, which was the first time she had been in the stone house, and it was exactly what it should have been for a man who built things to last: solid and simple and well-made, with a working fire and clean floors and bookshelves that surprised her for the number of books on them. She noticed the books the way she noticed most things, quickly and completely. She gave him the letter. He read it. His face went very still. Your uncle, he said. Apparently, she said. He's been dead since spring. Yes, he cannot answer for it. She paused. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know how involved he was. But the letter exists, and Covington's people will know it exists, and I think the Marshal needs to know about it before they find it and use it. Edgar looked at her. You found this and brought it to me, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Yes, your uncle was involved. Apparently. This complicates not the substance of the Navarro claim. The deed is solid and the Marshal has it. But it could complicate the proceedings if Covington's lawyers get hold of this, and I know, she said. That's why I brought it to you instead of just filing it away or burning it. Some people would have burned it, he said, protected their family name. Some people would have, she said. I think doing the right thing is more important than protecting a family name, especially when the family in question is a dead uncle I barely knew. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight of his house, with the fire going and the winter dark outside and the letter in his hand, and something moved through his expression that she had not seen on a person's face directed at her in a very long time, something that was recognition and gratitude and the particular tenderness of a person who has just been given without conditions exactly what they needed. He set the letter on the table. He said, quietly, Ida, I need to tell you something. All right, she said. I have spent 12 years making sure I didn't have to do this. I have been very careful and very deliberate about not being vulnerable to anyone. He was choosing the words carefully, the way he chose everything carefully. And I am finding that you have, without doing anything in particular, made that impossible. She was quiet, looking at him. I don't think you came here for this, he said. I came here for the store, she said honestly. I know that. And I am not asking you to feel something you don't feel. He stopped and started again, and she could see what it cost him, and she did not look away from it. I wanted you to know that you are the most honest person I have encountered in a long time, and that I have noticed you. Not in the way that requires anything from you, just I notice you. I wanted you to know that. The fire crackled. Outside, the desert night was absolute and cold and full of stars. "Edgar," she said, and his name in her mouth was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I notice you too. I have been noticing you since October, and I have been telling myself it was just practical attention." "Was it?" he said. "No," she said, "it wasn't." They stood there for a moment, two people who had not been looking for each other, standing in the light of a fire in a stone house in the Arizona Territory in January of 1884, with 12 years of his careful solitude and 3 months of her careful practicality between them, and something real and quiet and solid beginning to grow in the space that had been cleared by their mutual refusal to perform anything. He reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, the kind that doesn't require explanation, the kind that simply means I am here and so are you, and that is a real thing. "I should get this letter to Tombstone," he said, but he didn't move. "Tomorrow," she said. "It can wait until tomorrow." They stayed by the fire and talked for 2 more hours, and this time it was not about deeds and zinc sulfate and practical matters. This time it was about real things, about Richmond and what happened, which he told her in full, and about Missouri and Kansas City, and the years of seamstress work and the grinding weight of a respectable life going nowhere, which she told him in full, and about books, which it turned out they had both loved for different reasons and in different ways, and about the land, about what it was to be in a place this large and spare and indifferent, and how that indifference was somehow a relief after the pressure of people. When she left, it was late, and Burl had come in from the bunkhouse on some invented errand, and had seen the two of them at the table with the easy posture of people who have been talking for a long time and who trust each other. And he had gone back out without saying anything, but with an expression that, in the dark of the January night, was a smile that nobody saw. The following Saturday, Edgar rode to Tombstone with both the deed and the Franklin Collins letter, and Marshal Callahan received both with the same methodical competence. He confirmed that the Collins letter, while potentially complicated, actually worked in the Navarro family's favor, because it demonstrated the extent of Covington's network of influence and the long history of the scheme. The proceedings moved forward, and within 6 weeks, at the beginning of February, the county land records were corrected, Covington's fraudulent claim was rejected, and Alejandro Navarro and his family were officially and legally confirmed as the rightful owners of their land and their water access at Agua Dulce Creek. Covington, faced with federal proceedings and the exposure of his methods, did not send Garth Sable or anyone else to make further threats. He retreated to Tombstone and eventually left the territory entirely, which was, as Ruth Abernethy observed, the best possible outcome for everyone and a profound relief. The Navarro family came back to Hollow Creek in February, and Alejandro Navarro came to the Stone Ranch the day after they returned, and he stood in Edgar's yard in the cold February morning and shook Edgar's hand for a long time without saying very much, because some things are too large for words. Edgar came to town that afternoon and told Ida it was done, and she was behind her counter with her account ledger, and she looked up when he came in, and when he told her, she set the ledger down and said, very quietly, "I'm glad." "So am I," he said. The Navarro family came in the next day to stock up for their return to their ranch, and Alejandro Navarro, a broad, weathered man of 50 with a voice like low thunder and eyes that had seen a great deal and forgiven most of it, looked at Ida over the counter and said, "You are the woman who brought the letter." "I found it," she said. "Edgar told me," he said. "You could have hidden it or burned it. You didn't." "No," she said. "My family is in your debt," he said. "Please don't be," she said. "Just keep the land." He looked at her for a long time with those weathered, perceptive eyes, and then he glanced at Edgar, who was standing near the door with the expression of a man who is trying to look like he's just there incidentally, and then he looked back at Ida, and his face did something warm and knowing. "You are a good woman," he said, and the way he said it meant more than the words. After the Navarros left, Edgar stayed. He stayed for an hour, which was now something that happened. The way the quality of his visits had changed over the past weeks from purely transactional to something that included conversation, and sometimes silence, and sometimes, increasingly, the simple pleasure of being in the same space as a person who did not require anything of you, but who was glad you were there. "I would like to take you to Sunday dinner," he said, when they had talked themselves through the week's news and arrived at one of those comfortable silences. "At the hotel, if you would like." She looked at him, and this time she did smile, the real one that changed a room. "I would like that," she said. Ruth Abernethy, who had been pretending to examine a display of boot-blacking tins in the corner for the past 20 minutes, emitted a small sound that she immediately turned into a cough. "You can come out from behind the display now, Ruth," Ida said, without turning her head. Ruth emerged looking unrepentant. "I was shopping," she said. "You don't wear boots," Ida said. "I might start," Ruth said. Edgar looked at her with the expression that was definitively, unmistakably, actually a smile. The first full smile Ruth Abernethy had seen on his face in 4 years of being his neighbor on Main Street, and he put on his hat and went out with something in his step that had not been there before. Ruth turned to Ida with the expression of a woman whose investment in a situation has just been fully vindicated. "Ida Collins," she said. "Don't," Ida said. "You did it," Ruth said. "By not doing anything. By doing exactly what I needed to do," Ida said, "which was my work. And being yourself," Ruth said. "Those are the same thing," Ida said, but she was smiling when she said it. Sunday dinner at the Copper Star Hotel was the talk of Hollow Creek for 3 days afterward. Though the dinner itself was simple and quiet and deeply pleasant, roast beef and potatoes and pie, and conversation that moved easily between the personal and the practical and the places where those two things, for both of them, turned out to be the same territory. Edgar told her about Virginia, about what it had looked like before the war, about the farm his father had kept, and the way the seasons worked there, different from here in every way. And she told him about Missouri, about the river smell in spring, and the way her mother made bread on cold mornings, and the slow drowning of everything good when the money ran out. They talked about books again. He had a copy of Dickens's Bleak House that he had read 3 times, and she had read it twice, and they disagreed productively about one of the characters, which is one of the finest possible things 2 people can do together. They talked about what they wanted. Not in the large abstract sense, but in the immediate practical sense of people who have learned to think in seasons rather than decades. What did the spring look like? What needed to be done? What was worth building? He walked her back to the hotel after dinner through the cold February evening, and at the door he took her hand again, the same simple gesture as before. "I am not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware of that." "You are doing perfectly well," she said. "I am slow," he said. "I have been alone a long time, and Edgar," she said, "I am not in a hurry. I am not going anywhere. I have a store and an inventory and all the time in the world." He looked at her. "You are remarkably easy to be around," he said, and for a man of 12 years of careful silence, that was a declaration of the highest order. "So are you," she said, "when you let yourself." He pressed her hand before he let it go and went home. Spring came slowly to the Arizona territory, and with it a thaw that was more internal than external, though the days did warm and the desert went through its brief, brilliant eruption of color. The prickly pear blooming yellow and the ocotillo blazing orange, and the air losing its sharp edge, and becoming something that a person could walk in without a coat by mid-morning. Edgar and Ida were, by the standards of Hollow Creek in 1884, conducting a courtship. This meant that he came to town more often than his supply schedule required, and she sometimes rode out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, and they were seen together regularly enough that the town had absorbed the information and settled into a kind of collective warmth about it, the way a town will settle into collective warmth about something it approves of. Ruth Abernethy said, to anyone who asked and several people who didn't, that she had known from the very first week. Miriam Porter, who had become something closer to a real friend of Ida's than either of them had initially expected, said simply that it was the right outcome and meant it. Burl Egan, asked by the other ranch hands for his opinion since he worked most closely with Edgar and had known him longest, said only that the man deserved it, which was, in Burl's economical moral universe, the highest possible endorsement. Alejandro Navarro told his wife Maria that the woman at the store was the kind of person who made other people better without trying to, and Maria said that, in her experience, those were the rarest and best kind of people, and she intended to invite Miss Collins to dinner at the Navarro Ranch as soon as they had the house properly set right again. The practical things in Edgar and Ida's individual lives were also settling into better arrangements. Ida had decided to take the small house that Franklin had left at the edge of town. It needed work, but it was solid adobe and had a good garden patch, and she could see the mountains from the back window, which was a thing she had not known she needed until she had it. She spent her evenings of early spring making it into something that was genuinely hers, painting the shutters and planting seeds, and bringing the wood floors back to something you could be glad of. Edgar came one Saturday to help with a repair the roof needed, and brought Burl and two of the other hands, and they had the roof sound in a morning and ate lunch in the small garden in the April sunshine. And it was one of those unremarkable days that a person knows, even while it's happening, will stay with them. After the others had gone and Ida was making coffee and Edgar was looking at the bookshelves she had started arranging, he found, between her copy of Middlemarch and a practical guide to small business accounting, a slim volume of poetry he had not expected. Walt Whitman, he said. Leaves of Grass, she said. From 1867. My mother had it. It was the only book that came through all the moves. He took it down and opened it, and she brought the coffee and they sat at the small kitchen table in her new house in the April afternoon, and he read something aloud from it without any preface or explanation, just started reading, in his quiet, steady voice, and she sat across the table with her hands around her coffee cup and listened. It was that sort of afternoon, the kind that settles into a person the way water settles into good ground. In May, he asked her to marry him. He did it the way he did everything, directly and without performance. They were sitting on the porch of the Stone house in the evening, and the sky was doing the impossible thing Arizona skies do at that hour, going through 7 colors in 20 minutes, and he turned to her and said plainly, "I want you to stay, not at the hotel and not just in town, here, with me. I want to marry you if you'll have me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "You are asking me to give up the store," she said. "No," he said. "The store is yours. I am asking you to share a life with me, which means sharing whatever the store is and whatever this ranch is and figuring out the rest together." She turned and looked at him, and in the evening light his face was open in a way she had watched it work toward, through all the months of careful trust and slow honesty, and she understood that this was what he looked like when he wasn't protected, and it was finer and realer than anything he showed the world. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Edgar." He let out a breath that had been held in for longer than either of them could have precisely measured. They were married in June, in the church on Main Street, with the whole of Hollow Creek in attendance, because that was how a small town does the things that matter to it. Ruth Abernethy wore her best dress and wept happily. Miriam Porter threw rice with genuine warmth. Burl Egan stood up for Edgar with the dignity and slight embarrassment of a man who is very glad to be where he is. Alejandro and Maria Navarro and their 3 sons sat in the front pew, and Maria brought flowers from the Navarro Ranch's garden that she had gotten growing again in the spring, brilliant desert flowers in red and gold. Ida wore a dress she had made herself from fabric from her own store, a deep blue that was the color of the sky an hour after sunset, and she walked down the aisle of the church with no one to give her away because she had no family left to do it, just herself, walking steadily and directly toward the man at the altar who was watching her with those clear gray eyes in the way that she had come to understand, meant everything he could not yet find words for. The preacher, a compact, serious man named Holt, performed the ceremony with genuine conviction, and when he got to the part about the joining of lives, he paused and looked at the two of them and said, departing from the script, "I have watched this town long enough to know when two people are right for each other. These two are right for each other." There were people in the congregation who cried. Ruth Abernethy was among them. Burl Egan was not, but it was close. That summer was the finest summer either of them had known in a long time. They ran the ranch and the store with the kind of complementary efficiency that comes when two people are both organized and both practical and both disinclined to sentimentalize work, which does not mean they were cold about it. Quite the opposite. Because they brought to everything they did together the warmth that had been accumulating since October, when a woman with a single leather satchel had walked off a stage and filled a man's order without batting her eyes at him. Ida kept the store going through the week, with Tommy Pratt now fully employed and a second part-time hand she had hired, a capable young woman named Delia who had come from Santa Fe and needed work. On weekends she was at the ranch, learning the rhythms of it, which were different from the rhythms of the store but had the same satisfying quality of meaningful work producing visible results. Edgar, who had spent 12 years running everything by himself, discovered that having a partner who was his equal in intelligence and judgment, and who challenged his thinking without undermining his confidence, was something he had not known he was missing, and that missing it had been quietly costly in ways he was only now beginning to measure. They argued sometimes, in the productive way, about business decisions and ranch management and the right approach to a problem, and neither of them conceded until they thought the argument had found its end, which meant that sometimes Ida was right, and sometimes Edgar was right, and occasionally they arrived somewhere neither of them had started, which was the best outcome. They were also, it must be said, deeply in love with each other in the way that people who have chosen each other carefully and honestly tend to be. Not the frantic, passionate love of novels, but the steadier, fiercer love of people who have come through difficult things and found in another person a place of genuine rest and genuine challenge and genuine delight. In the autumn, Alejandro Navarro came to the ranch one evening with a bottle of brandy, a good one, from a merchant he knew in Tucson, and the four of them, Edgar and Ida and Alejandro and Maria, sat on the porch of the stone house and watched the sun go down and talked about everything and nothing and drank the brandy slowly. And Maria told the story of how she and Alejandro had met, which involved a river crossing and a borrowed horse, and a misunderstanding about a name that had made them both furious and then helpless with laughter, and they all laughed at it. And the evening was gold and warm, and the kind of thing that makes a person understand what they are alive for. "To solid ground," Edgar said, lifting his glass, and Ida understood the reference and she lifted hers. "To solid ground," she said. That winter, Ida told Edgar she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in November, very directly, as she told him everything. She said, "I want you to know I am pregnant. I think about 4 months along." He put his coffee cup down. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen, which was not large, in 2 steps, and he held her face in his hands with a gentleness that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, and he said, quietly and with his gray eyes very clear, "I did not think I would have this." "You have it," she said. "Yes," he said, "I do." Burl found out the next morning, because Edgar told him, which was another sign of how much had changed. The man who had managed everything alone for 12 years, who had trusted no one with anything personal, had told his foreman about his wife's pregnancy before the week was out because he had been thinking about it all night, and it was too large to contain. "Congratulations," Burl said, and shook his hand, and his face did the thing it did when he was genuinely moved, which was to become very still and very serious while his eyes said everything. Ruth Abernethy found out from Ida and immediately began knitting, because that was what Ruth did when she was happy. She was an excellent knitter, and by the time the baby was due, she had assembled a complete wardrobe for a child of unknown size and temperament. The Navarro family was told over Sunday dinner at their newly rebuilt ranch house in December, and Maria, who had 3 grown sons and missed babies, immediately offered everything she knew about what to expect, which was considerable, and Ida absorbed it all in the attentive way she absorbed everything useful. Spring came again, and in late March of 1885, Ida gave birth to a son. They named him Franklin James Stone Franklin for her uncle, complicated and imperfect as he had turned out to be, because you do not have to approve entirely of someone to acknowledge their part in how you arrived somewhere good, and James for Edgar's own father, gone these many years but present in the way that the people who made us are always present. Frank, as he came to be called almost immediately, was a solid, interested, surprisingly loud child who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's tendency toward careful attention to the world around him. He was adored by everyone on the ranch, spoiled in the best sense by Ruth Abernethy, endlessly entertained by the Navarro family, and regarded by Burl Egan with the particular deep affection of a man who has no children of his own and pours that love into the children of the people he cares about. Hollow Creek itself continued to grow as the Arizona Territory was growing. The Southern Pacific Railroad had arrived in Tucson. Things were changing. New people came. New businesses opened. Collins Mercantile continued to do well, because Ida was a good businesswoman and Hollow Creek was a going concern, and she had the particular advantage of being trusted, which is the most valuable thing a business can have. The Stone Ranch continued to thrive, because Edgar was relentless in his care of it, and now had the additional resource of Ida's sharp commercial mind when it came to the business decisions that ranching, like all enterprises, required. 2 years after Frank was born, Ida was pregnant again, and this time it was a daughter, who came in the autumn of 1887, and they named her Clara, for no particular person, but because the name suited her from the first moment she arrived, which was with the same focused determination that both her parents brought to everything. Frank, who was 2.5 and already opinionated, inspected his sister with the seriousness of a boy who had been told this was important and said, after a moment, "She's small." "She'll get bigger," Edgar said. Frank seemed to find this acceptable. "Good," he said. Ruth Abernethy resumed knitting. The years settled into the rich and varied substance of lives genuinely lived. There were good years and hard years and years with drought and years with everything going right and years where something broke. A fence, a friendship, a business arrangement, and had to be repaired and sometimes came back better than before and sometimes didn't. But the ground under them was solid, built of the same material that had made them what they were individually: honesty and practical attention, and the refusal to perform what you did not feel and the willingness to feel it fully when it was real. Edgar still had his difficult silences, the times when the old wounds from Richmond or the years of solitude made him withdraw into himself, and Ida had learned not to chase him into those silences, but to be present outside them, patient and without demand, which was what he needed and what she had always, by her nature, known how to give. Ida still had her practicality, the tendency toward doing rather than talking about doing, and Edgar had learned to reach her through the practical, to express what he felt through what he built, what he repaired, what he planned, which was his native language, and she understood it. They were, by the accounting of everyone who knew them, not a romantic story in the conventional sense of the word romantic. There were no dramatic declarations in public, no performances of affection that required an audience. What they had was realer than that and harder to name, the specific and serious happiness of two people who have found in each other the rare gift of being fully known and fully accepted and still genuinely wanted. The night before Edgar had pulled the gun, the night that had opened this story, the night that had seemed in its first moments like the worst possible ending, had actually been the last moment of danger before everything was finally, fully resolved. Garth Sable, Covington's former enforcer, had returned to the territory after Covington's departure, operating on his own now, and had been trying to recover what leverage he could from the old situations. He had found out about the Franklin Collins letter, about the copy that Edgar had submitted to the marshals, and he had determined that Edgar's house must contain other documents from the Navarro case that could be useful. He had broken into the Stone house that evening while Edgar was working the far pasture. Ida had been there alone, and she had surprised him, and when Edgar came home and found the situation, he had not been thinking clearly in those first terrible seconds, because the possibility of Ida being hurt had done to him exactly what any genuine love does to a person. It had dissolved all of his careful walls and left only the raw terror of losing the thing that mattered most. He had drawn the gun by instinct and pointed it at the person he found standing in his kitchen, and for those 15 seconds before his vision cleared and he saw that it was Ida, that she was unharmed, that Sable had fled, Edgar Stone had been as frightened as he had ever been in his life. "You went through my papers," he had said, because his mind had seized on the first concrete fact it could find, and she had said yes calmly, because she had been looking for evidence to explain what Sable had been searching for, and then she had said shoot me, because she had understood in a flash of clear perception that the only way through his terror was to not flinch from it, and it had worked, and the gun had come down. Garth Sable was apprehended 2 days later by Sheriff Voss, who had been building a case against him for months on other matters, and was taken to Tombstone to answer for his various activities, and that was the end of that particular threat. Edgar, the night it had happened, had sat down at his kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and looked at his wife, who was standing across from him completely composed except that her hands had finally started trembling very slightly, and he had said, "I'm never going to be able to fully express how sorry I am for what just happened. You didn't hurt me," she said. "I pointed a gun at you. You were frightened. You didn't know it was me." She paused. "And you put it down." "Of course I put it down. Then we're all right," she said. He looked at her for a long time, and then he stood and came around the table and held her, and she let herself be held, which was something she didn't always do easily, and his arms around her were the same thing as everything else about him, solid and real and built on ground that was not going to give way. "I am in love with you," he said, and it was the first time those specific words had been said between them in quite that form, and it was the right time for them. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since January, when you sat in my back room and admitted you needed to talk to someone. That long," he said. "You're slow," she said, and she felt him laugh, which she loved the feeling of, his laugh against the top of her head, rare and entirely real. They were quiet for a while, standing in the kitchen of the Stone house with the lamp burning and the sound of the desert outside and Frank and Clara asleep in their rooms down the hall. "No one else ever did that," he said eventually. "Stood in front of something frightening and said go ahead. I wasn't performing bravery," she said. "I was simply, I know you." "I knew you wouldn't. You were more certain of that than I was," he said. "I have always been more certain of you than you are," she said. "That's what it means to be the person who loves you. I can see things about you that you can't see yourself." He held her tighter. "Tell me one," he said. "You are kind," she said, "in a way you don't give yourself credit for. Not soft, I don't mean that, but the men you keep on when others would let them go. The Navarro family, Burl, who you have given a home as much as a job. Tommy Pratt, who you recommended for work at the hardware store when I couldn't employ him full-time and nobody asked you to. You are genuinely kind, and you have built your whole reputation on being difficult so that nobody would find out." He was very still. "That is not what I intended," he said. "I know," she said. "Most of the things that make us most ourselves are not what we intended." They stood there a while longer, and then Frank called from his room. The boy slept lightly and had probably heard them talking, and the moment opened back into the warm noise of family, and Edgar went to settle his son and Ida put the kettle on, and the night turned from its frightened beginning into the ordinary goodness that was, by now, their ordinary life. That night, after the children were settled and the house was quiet, they sat by the fire and Ida read aloud from a new book she had ordered through the store, a novel set in England that neither of them had read, and Edgar mended a piece of leather harness work by the lamp, and the fire burned down slowly, and outside the desert was cold and full of stars, and the stone house was exactly what it was meant to be, a house that held a life. There was one more thing that happened that year, which was that Burl Egan met a woman. Her name was Agnes Webb, and she came to Hollow Creek in the summer as the wife of the new doctor, a younger man named Price who had been recruited by the town council to replace the previous doctor who had retired to California. Agnes Webb Price was 37, clear-eyed and practical, a woman who had been keeping a doctor's household for 8 years and who knew exactly who she was and asked nothing of anyone that she wasn't prepared to give back. She came into Collins Mercantile in her first week in town, and she and Ida talked for 45 minutes about inventory and the difference between what people said they needed and what they actually needed, because in a doctor's household that distinction was always pointed. Burl encountered her at a Sunday church social in August, and she shook his hand and looked at him with those clear eyes and asked him directly what he did, and he told her, and she said she thought ranching was honest work and she had a deep respect for people who did honest work well. And Burl, who was 41 and had never expected anything like this, walked home from that social with a bewildered expression that Edgar recognized immediately. "You met someone," Edgar said. "I didn't say that," Burl said. "You have the look," Edgar said. Burl looked at him. "What look?" "The look," Edgar said, "of a person who has just found out that the door they thought was permanently closed is in fact open." Burl was quiet for a moment. "What do I do?" he said. Edgar looked at him steadily. "You go back and talk to her," he said, "and you are exactly who you are and you don't perform anything and you trust that what is real between two people will find its way." Burl raised his eyebrows slightly. "Is that what happened with you and Ida?" "Something like that," Edgar said. There was a pause. "Thank you," Burl said. "I believe I owe you a debt in that department," Edgar said, with something in his voice that was dry and warm at once, the way his humor worked when he let it out. Agnes Webb Price was a widow. It turned out her first husband had died of consumption 3 years ago in Missouri, and the marriage to Dr. Price was her second, and Dr. Price, a decent man who was entirely absorbed in his medicine, understood very quickly that his wife and Edgar Stone's foreman were the sort of friends who might become more, and he was of the opinion that Agnes deserved happiness in whatever form it arrived, and that his marriage being what it was, a practical and warm partnership without love of the deeper kind, was no reason to stand in the way of her finding something truer. What actually happened in that quarter was a long and dignified story that Hollow Creek watched with the same attentive warmth it had given to Edgar and Ida, and it resolved in its own time, and in the way that right things resolve carefully, honestly, without drama, with the particular grace of people who have learned through loss to value the real thing when it appears. By the time Frank Stone was 5 years old and Clara Stone was nearly 3, and Burl Egan had found his own solid ground, and the Stone Ranch had grown to 300 head, and Collins Mercantile had expanded to the building next door, Hollow Creek had the look of a place that had found its best version of itself. Some of the original generation of women who had tried to reach Edgar Stone had married other men and built other lives and were, most of them, quite happy. Miriam Porter had married a surveyor who came through in 1886 and had 2 children, and wrote to Ida occasionally with the easy warmth of a friendship that had grown from complicated beginnings. Clara Dawson ran a school of her own now, in a new building the town had built. Ruth Abernethy sold her saddle shop to her nephew and took on a partnership in the Mercantile, which had been Ida's idea, and which worked perfectly because Ruth knew everyone and everyone liked her, and she sold things with the enthusiasm of a person who found genuine joy in the transaction. On a fall evening in 1889, Edgar and Ida sat on the porch of the stone house and watched the sky do its October thing, all fire and amber, and the slow darkening into a purple so deep it was almost a color that had no name. Frank was inside doing something with a book because at 4 he had decided books were important the way his parents had, and Clara was asleep already, being 2 and having strong opinions about bedtime that she expressed by falling asleep mid-sentence in the middle of the kitchen floor if you didn't get there in time. "I want to tell you something," Ida said. Edgar looked at her. "Another child," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's 3, he said. "I can count," she said. "3 is good," he said. "It is," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture as the first time, in the kitchen of her back room in January of 1884. The gesture that meant I am here and so are you, and that is a real thing. Except that now it contained everything that had been built in the years since. The trust and the arguments and the laughter and the hard seasons and the solid seasons and the children asleep inside, and the ranch and the store and the life they had made, not from a plan but from 2 people being honest about who they were and what they needed and what they could give. "I did not know," Edgar said, "that this was what my life was going to look like." "What did you think it was going to look like?" Asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Smaller," he said, "more defended." "It is better this way," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." The night settled around them, cool and clear, the desert full of the sounds it makes when the day has gone and the stars come out fully, the insects and the far call of something wild and the wind through the dry grass and the creak of the porch boards and the dim light from the kitchen window where Franklin James Stone, age 4, was working out his feelings about a picture book. It was by any measure a full life, a real one, built not on performance or strategy or the pursuit of something uncertain, but on the simple, difficult daily practice of being exactly what you are with a person who receives you exactly as such. That was the thing that every woman in Hollow Creek had tried to give Edgar Stone, not through manipulation or dishonesty, not most of them, but through the effort of reaching toward him, the effort of trying to be what they thought he needed, the effort of being seen rather than simply being. And the thing that Ida Collins had done, from the first moment she read his supply list back to him without batting her eyes, was simply be. She had not tried to reach him. She had simply been present and honest and real, and he had come to her. That was how it worked in the end. Not the dramatic version, not the performance version, not the version where love is a conquest or a prize to be won. The real version, the version that held. The version that, 6 years after a woman got off a stage with a leather satchel and no particular plan, had produced a stone house full of children and books and lamplight, and a man who had spent 12 years alone now sitting on his porch in the fall evening with his hand around the hand of the woman who had taught him, simply by not trying, that solid ground was not something you found. It was something 2 people made together, one honest day at a time. The 3rd child arrived in the spring, another son, born early on a clear April morning with the desert outside just beginning its brief brilliance. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that it suited him from the first breath, the same way the land suited them both without explanation, without condition, simply and completely. Frank, who was now 5 and fully authoritative on the subject of siblings, declared Thomas acceptable after a careful inspection, which was the highest rating he had yet assigned to anything. Clara, nearly 3, was interested for approximately 4 minutes and then went back to her primary concern, which was the small pile of smooth stones she had been collecting from the creek bed and organizing by color. Burl Egan held Thomas in the yard on a May morning, carefully, in the way of large men with small children, with a tenderness so obvious that Edgar, watching from the porch, felt the particular gratitude of a man who has watched someone he cares for find their way into happiness. Agnes Webb was there too, sitting in the yard in the spring morning, talking to Ida about something practical and important as they always were, and her hand was around a cup of coffee, and she was laughing at something, and the April light was on her face, And Burl looked over at her from across the yard with a look that was its own quiet, complete story. Hollow Creek went on. The territory went on, changing and growing and pressing towards statehood, which would come in the future and which would bring new things, good and complicated both. The Stone Ranch went on, solid and working and real. Collins Mercantile went on, a little larger now, a little more established, the kind of store that had become part of the fabric of a community in the way that businesses only become when they are run by people who care about more than the margin. And Edgar and Ida Stone went on, which is the only ending for a love like theirs. Not a single moment of resolution, but the ongoing living of a life. The daily practice of two people who have chosen each other and continue to choose each other. Through the ordinary mornings and the difficult seasons and the evenings on the porch, and the arguments that find their way to understanding, and the silences that are full rather than empty. There is a particular quality to that kind of love, the kind that was built not from trying but from being, not from pursuit but from presence. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not need an audience. It does not perform. It simply holds. The way solid ground holds. The way a well-built stone house holds through everything the desert and the years can throw at it. The way two people hold when they have found in each other the rarest thing. Not a mirror, not a savior, not a conquest, but a companion. Someone who sees you fully, knows you truly, and stays. Out on the east road from Hollow Creek, the Agua Dulce Creek ran clear and year-round through the Navarro land, the way it always had, the way it would continue to do when all the people of this story were long since gone, and only the land remembered. The land remembered everything in the Arizona territory, the silver that had come out of it and the cattle that had crossed it, and the families that had held it through drought and fire, and the designs of men who thought they could own what was not theirs to own. And somewhere on a shelf in the stone house on the Stone Ranch, between Middlemark and Bleak House and the Home Veterinary Guide and the Business Accounting Manual, sat a worn copy of Leaves of Grass, 1867 edition, with a bookmark at a page Edgar Stone had once read aloud to the woman he loved on a Sunday afternoon when neither of them had been looking for the other, and had found each other anyway. It was, as far as anyone in Hollow Creek could tell, exactly how it was supposed to go. Frank grew tall and had his mother's careful mind and his father's gray eyes and grew up knowing, in the way that children know things they cannot yet fully articulate, that a love like his parents' was not a common thing and was worth being formed by. Clara grew into exactly what her first moments had promised: direct, organized, certain of herself in the way that daughters become when they have been raised by people who are honest. And she would have her own story someday. But that is another story, set in a later year when the territory had become a state, and the world had moved on from the frontier into whatever came next. Thomas, the spring child, was 3 years younger than Clara and would grow up to love the ranch the way his father did, with a practical and physical devotion, and he would be, in the years to come, the one who kept the Stone Ranch going through the next generation, who carried the water rights and the pasture knowledge and the careful accounting forward into a time neither Edgar nor Ida would live to see fully. But that was in the future, and the present was enough. The present was October in the Arizona Territory, 1889, and a man and a woman on a porch, watching the sky do something no painter could quite capture, in the quiet certainty of two people who have built something real. "Edgar," Ida said, "yes, I'm glad I came to Hollow Creek." He turned and looked at her, the man who had spent 12 years building walls and one woman who had never once tried to climb them, who had simply waited with her own life fully occupied until he found his own way out. "So am I," he said. "It was the store," she said. "I know," he said. "It's always the store." And she laughed, which was a sound that the stone house had come to know the way it knew the wind and the creek and the bells of the church in town on Sunday mornings. As one of the things that made a place into a home, as one of the ordinary miraculous sounds of a life being fully, gratefully, improbably, completely lived. The stars came out over the Arizona desert, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, indifferent and magnificent and wholly indifferent to human plans and human hearts, and the stories those hearts made of the time given them. And in the stone house on the East Road, the lamps burned warm and all was well.